Just before we start the event, just a few quick safety announcements. One, there's no fire drill, so if you hear any fire alarm, please follow the fire exit signs. So there's fire exit from this side, fire exit from the other side. The assembly point is just down there. The other thing is, as you might know, there are like ongoing protests in the university, so we're not expecting anything specific to this event, but in case something happens, we have procedures in place. We're allowing people to express their opinions, and we have designated people to deal with that, so should be fine. The other thing is we're live streaming, filming the event, so just please be aware of that. You won't be shown in the video, but obviously if you want to ask questions, please use the mics, and that'll be shown in the live stream. So welcome everyone, thank you for coming, and thanks for the panelists. We have today Simone Turchetti, who is a professor of history of science and technology at the University of Manchester. He did his PhD also in the University of Manchester 20 years ago in the history of science, following the lives of Italian academics in the UK. His research interests include history of 20th century science and technology, science and international relations, history of geosciences, historiography of science, and history of nuclear weapons and nuclear science. He's the author of the book, The Pontecorvo Affair, A Cold War, Defection, and Nuclear Physics. His current roles include president of one of the founders of the Commission on Science, Technology and Diplomacy, STAND, chair of the Center of History of Science, Technology and Medicine, the secretary of European Society of the History of Science. He also teaches a module called Nuclear Age, Global Threats from Hiroshima to Today. Thank you for coming, Simone. We also have Fiona Rayment, who's internationally recognized expert in nuclear energy with a wealth of experience in different organizations. She had a PhD from University of Strathclyde, Glasgow, and MBA from Manchester Business School. Her roles include being a special advisor to the CEO of Nuclear National Laboratory, a member of the Office of Nuclear Regulation, Chief Nuclear Inspectors Independent Advisory Panel, President-elect of UK Nuclear Institute, Vice Chair of OECD Nuclear Energy Agency Steering Committee, Chair of Scientific Advisory Committee of the Energy Division at CEA, non-executive member of UK Space Agency, a non-executive director of Nuclear Restoration Services and patron of Women in Nuclear. She was also executive director of the Nuclear Innovation and Research Office, NARO, and a member of Euratom Science and Technology Committee, and policy director of the Generation 4 International Forum. Thank you for coming, Fiona. Good to have you. We have also Andy Stirling, Professor of Science and Technology Policy at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. He had an MA in Archaeology and Social Anthropology from the University of Edinburgh, and he completed his PhD in 1994 on the UK and international policy innovation in nuclear and renewable energy, and has been working with that for the last 30 years. He's a fellow of the UK Academy of Social Science, co-directed the ESRC STEP Centre, served as Science Director at the Science Policy Research Unit, University of Sussex, Research Director for the Sussex University Business School, and Deputy Director of Sustainable Lifestyle Research Group. Good to have you, Andy.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Professor Richard Taylor, who's a BNFL chair in nuclear energy system at the University of Manchester Data Nuclear Institute. He is previously the chief engineer of the UK's National Nuclear Laboratory. He has 30 years of experience within the nuclear industry, did a degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Leeds, and has a background designing, constructing, and commissioning nuclear facilities. Richard is the co-founder of the Beam Nuclear and Social Research Institute. Good to have you. Welcome, everyone. Let's start the discussion by asking the main question of why we're here today. and which is, do you think nuclear is the path forward to achieve net zero? Can you start by Simone, maybe?
Right. So, first of all, why I'm here? Why I'm here? So I'm an historian of science and technology. So I'll leave to the experts in the room to actually talk about what's going on right now. I ran this course called the Nuclear Age, which I've been running for the last 10 years. What is funny is that I think before the pandemic, the actual lecture theatre for that course was exactly this room. So I'm back, you know, with I don't know, a new kind of cohort of students. I hope you're not a cohort of students. You're kind of, I see from the kind of age range probably you're past that age of being a student. Some are actually. I can recognize faces from, yes, exactly, from the unit. What we do is essentially look at the history of primarily nuclear weapons, but also atomic energy, starting obviously with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We go through some of the issues that obviously are more controversial about both nuclear weapons and atomic energy, and try to kind of, I wouldn't say even give answers, but rather look together into the questions. Students go out there, do amazing projects, right? I mean, if I'm kind of saying something wrong, correct me. Do amazing projects, do research, and look exactly at these very issues. You know, how far can we think nuclear age can address? Also some of the problems that we actually currently face, including the question of net zero. Exactly because I run the classroom, but I don't give the answers. I'm not going to answer the question whether atomic energy, nuclear energy is the solution to net zero. I think, but I was looking at the statistics and, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems that essentially what we are talking about is what counts as the global electricity production that needs to be converted either into renewable energies or nuclear energy over the running of the next, I don't know, let's say 50 years, right? And that accounts for, and again, I hope that percentage is not wrong, for 30% at the moment, around between 25 and 30%. 10% of makes the energy, the electricity energy mix in terms of atomic energy, and around 10 to 15 on renewable energies. So to me at the moment, the key problem is the remaining 75%, which is fossil fuel, non-renewable energy, and that is exactly the kind of mother of stake. So what I would say, just as I think as a starting point, is it is absolutely urgent that we actually address the problem of that 75. There's a 30%, I was reading this morning, 30% is coal. Coal, they're still running on coal for 30%. So I see why the question that you're presenting with this panel is very important. Mm-hmm. I don't think is the key question at the moment. Is that essentially how we get out of that 75% is even more pressing question.
Yeah, Fiona, you have.
Well, the answer is yes. Do you want me to elaborate?
Yeah, go for it.
So start with the past. In terms of the UK over the last 6 or 7 decades has had nuclear energy producing electricity, and 1 in 5 homes in the UK consumed electricity from nuclear. That's the statistic, and it's only recently that's really started to diminish, and we've got to less than that, 20% of the electricity mix now being provided by nuclear. So nuclear's been doing this for decades here in the UK. That's the first thing to say. The next thing to say is to decarbonise the energy mix, to do deep decarbonisation. As you've said, electricity is only part of the story. 20 to 30% of our energy mix is electricity going forward. The rest of it, the deep decarbonisation from agriculture, from what happens in industry, from what we need to do in aerospace, from what we need to do in a whole variety of other areas, that requires deep decarbonisation as well. So actually we need to think about this beyond just the electricity mix. It's actually doing that deep decarbonisation beyond that. Now, the thing about nuclear is it can do all of that. It's, in terms of the nuclear technology that we've had over the last few decades, we just have a kettle. We're producing heat using fuel. That heat is converted to electricity. Now, it just so happens that's what we do. When we convert that to electricity, we actually lose, like, the energy equation. We will lose energy when we convert that heat to electricity. And so there's no reason why we can't co-generate and actually have nuclear that's actually producing heat as well as power and other things as well. We're very interested at the moment in looking at how nuclear can also start to get involved beyond just car and bus transportation and actually get interested in other parts of the energy mix too, that actually then starts to look at things like sustainable aviation fuels for transportation going forward in the air. And for that, again, nuclear can play a role in that. And so there's a whole variety of different nuclear technologies out there, some of which are very mature and have been used for decades, others which are either about to be at that level of maturity, and then some that are still a bit further off into the future. But I do think that nuclear can and has played a role in decarbonising the energy mix, and I think it can play an even bigger role going forward. And I think it does it as part of the energy mix with renewables. It's not a single solution. I think renewables has a role to play too, but nuclear can play that role too.
Yeah, perfect. Andy?
Thanks, Faisal. Well,
Yeah.
thanks for inviting me. I think I should say something at the outset because I think I'm here slightly in the critical slot that I'm expected to play. I'm happy to do so. But before I do that, I should say that I've worked on nuclear issues for more than 40 years. And over that time, I've acquired a huge respect for the expertise. The technology is amazing, what it takes to make this technology work. And maybe that fact is responsible for the really eccentric debates we have about it. So for instance, we ask, is nuclear energy the path? And already, Fiona, you rightly said, of course not. You didn't put it that way, but your answer was, of course not. There's others. Your point was more, it can have a role to play. It can be part of the mix. And also, as you said, Fiona, there's a sense in the nuclear field, it's almost entitled. If it had a role in the past, then it should have one now, because it has been, as you rightly said, 20%, 25%, up to 30% maximum, then it should be again. And I just don't know any other technology which talks like that. It's well known, it's perfectly normal. Technologies go obsolete. We'll have different views about whether that is occurring or not, but it has occurred with many technologies. Even combined cycle gas turbines now are becoming obsolete because of carbon emissions, certainly coal, oil before. So this is a routine thing. Why is it that with this technology, we don't seem to be able to contemplate and we don't check for it? So for instance, the British government, has not published comparative costs for nuclear and renewables since 2003 in white papers. That is shocking. The white papers declare commitments to nuclear, but they don't, as with respect, Fiona, you didn't mention, costs. Now, it's just not controversial that when you look at costs, nuclear around the world and in the UK is utterly outcompeted. We can talk more about the details when we get into it. It's utterly outcompeted. It's really eccentric for us to be having this discussion because it is so outcompeted. So the final point I'll make at the outset, just to kick things off, is, so why is that? Are people bad or stupid? No. In the UK, as in other nuclear-armed countries, we know that if we do not have a nuclear skills base in this country, we will not be able to build nuclear-propelled submarines. And for the British identity, or a large part of it, the seat at the top table that comes with that of international affairs is so crucial. In the words of Ernest Bevin, we'll pay any price to secure that prize. And the price is that we are currently paying between 2 and 3 times as much as we could for renewables. We're slowing down climate action as a result. We're making it less effective. And so we have different views, but I would say the issue isn't, is nuclear energy really the path toward net zero? under what possible scenario could nuclear justify itself as a part of a strategy to net zero? So I hope that's controversial enough. And you wanted to have the last word.
Well, Faisal, I'm afraid I'm going to take issue with your question as well.
Okay.
But I should say before I start that just adding to the list of achievements and roles that we all have taken on in our careers, I've just completed an MA in creative writing at the Manchester Met University. So you should bear in mind that everything I say I might just be making up.
I rest my case.
Yes.
I feel a book coming.
But here we go. So, really, I would say that's a closed question, isn't it? I can either say yes or no, and I think that my personal opinion on that particular question should not be of interest to anybody in this room. What I would say is that a more interesting question, perhaps, is what would it take, which sort of goes back to a little bit to what would it take for nuclear to be part of this solution to net zero? There's a whole generation of millennials and Gen Zers out there who really care about net zero, most of whom think their parents have messed it up for them. And what would it take for them to see the answer to that question as yes? And here's a thing you could think about. What would it take for them to say the problem with this is you're not making enough nuclear waste? That's the problem, because if you're going to do this, you need to make a lot more nuclear waste, and that needs to be perceived as a good thing. I've got an idea for a paper that's titled "The Celebration of Nuclear Waste," which I think could get quite a few hits, I suspect. So there's one question to think about. That is a consequence, you know. So could you get people who really care about this and feel they have an accountability to care? Could you get them thinking like that? Here's another question. If you think about little micro-reactors, which you can make in their thousands, what would it take for you to say, I want one of those on my high street or on my little retail park? Because we haven't got an M&S, so I want a nuclear reactor. It is an object of desire for me. You know, we've got a David Lloyd, so can we have and you know, what would that take? What would it take to commoditize this thing that we call nuclear, get it cheap, and disassociate it from the technology? These generations who care about this thing, they care about clean energy. They don't give us stuff about nuclear, and we shouldn't make them. We shouldn't think we've got to educate them so that they care about nuclear. What they care about is clean energy. So our job is to disassociate what we're doing from that, because that's what we do with commoditized products. That's what we do with things that we embrace. And that doesn't, just one final thing, that doesn't mean being I'd like to ban the phrase pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. If you say you're pro-nuclear, it means, yeah, a neutron hits that big particle and it splits apart, makes some energy into more neutrons. I'm against that. I don't think that should happen. I'm anti-nuclear. Well, tough, you know, it sort of happens. The technology is there. So what we're talking about is being pro or anti the application or the industry, and that is a different thing. My sister, don't know why, but she gave me a good line about this. She said that people are only motivated by fear or love, really. You know, and a lot of people fear nuclear, don't they? You mention nuclear and they go a bit, yeah, don't fancy that. But the good news is that fear and love are actually quite close to each other, and actually quite close to convert from one to the other. And it's actually indifference that's over here, and is very difficult to shift. So what I would suggest is, if you're scared of nuclear, and that's a really healthy thing, but you're only that far from loving it. Anyway.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Just to let you know, if anyone had any comments, questions throughout, please feel free to raise your hand. We have mics here, and we can take your questions. But for now, I have one question from my side, mainly for Fiona and Richard. We talked about like making it cheaper and more attractive. What's your views on the future? Like, what is the development that will achieve that in the future?
Do you want me to start? Do you want to start?
Yeah, you have a go. Well, I think.
So, the first thing to say is that in terms of the cost of nuclear here in this country, the cost of nuclear is about the fact that we are not good at building large infrastructure projects. It is not about nuclear technology. If you think about how many projects that we've actually stopped and started in this country and not had a supply chain to actually take it forward, that's why the cost of nuclear in this country is so expensive in terms of new build. We stop stock, we had Sizewell B, we put that forward in the 1990s as first of a kind, with an opportunity then to build more fleet build beyond that, but we didn't do it. So we built a whole supply chain for that one reactor, 2 reactors on site, basically, and then, didn't continue with it. So that is a major, major issue for us. We're finding it in all infrastructure projects, whether it's road, rail, Olympics, whatever it may be. We overrun. Why do we overrun? Because we don't build up a supply chain to enable that to happen. So, and that's what you're seeing currently in terms of the current new build programme in this country with Hinkley Point C. What's interesting, although the costs are still astronomical, was that as soon as they started to build Unit B of Hinkley Point C, 30% cost reductions started to happen, and they actually managed to start to get productivity even faster. Why? Because there was a supply chain in place to be able to take it forward. So you can see that if you actually have a supply chain, you can actually continue to take that forward. Next step. Currently, in terms of what we're doing in terms of the Hinkley site, it's a stick build project, as we call it. It is not factory build. And if you actually look at large infrastructure projects in the world, whether you're building a university, whether you're building a flat, whatever you're building, right? Everything is done now in a factory. They build factory modules, they bring it together. Most of the time, they actually try and put as much of it together in the factory as possible and then take it to the site. Why do they do that? Because if you're building something on a site, weather takes effect. We know what weather's like in this country. You can't predict it. You can't even predict when you're going to have a barbecue. I mean, you know when there's going to be a barbecue because Asda tends to kind of suddenly empty it of all the things that you can actually buy that morning because suddenly the sun's out. So you can't predict the weather in this country. So where you get to is that if you go in a factory and you build in a factory, you actually manage to increase your productivity by 7-fold in comparison to actually building on site. So that's another example of that. So then you go factory build. When you go factory build, you then start thinking about how can you actually have even more repeatability in factory. The way you do that is you have smaller reactors. So then you go factory build and you start looking at things like small modular reactors or micro reactors. And you actually start to get to a situation that you then have factories, that you do factory build and you're churning out reactors on a much more regular basis in comparison to what you do with the large systems. I'll stop there, Richard. I've teed you up.
Have you teed me up or have you said everything? I agree with all of that. Courage and commitment is the thing to building stuff, isn't it? Like Fiona said, and what we get vacillation. We get stop-start on projects. We get a loss of faith that they're the right thing to do. And generally it's that. It's very little to do with the technology generally. And one of the problems about that is that nuclear generally, almost exclusively, tends to be perceived as a distress purchase. Mm-hmm. It's something that you've got to buy because there's nothing better, So, and when you start doing it in that context, then this prevarication happens. It's also subject to political vagaries as well. So that is the principal problem. And the other thing is going back to what Fiona said about economies of multiples. The way you make small reactors cheap is you build lots of them. And we get a lot of language about saying, yeah, we need small modular reactors, we're going to build one of them. So none of those potential economies are actually realised and we all lose faith before it actually happens. So there are lots of ways to do it better, but very little of them are to do with nuclear.
Yeah. Andy, you had something to add?
Yeah, I do really. So I won't contest what Richard or Fiona have said. I'll just point out what they've both been saying. Richard, in the last intervention, was saying, what would it take for nuclear to be acceptable? And Fiona's just made the point about how can nuclear costs come down from what are implicitly acknowledged to be unfeasibly uncompetitive levels. What we haven't heard is that nuclear is competitive. And I'm used over most of my life as a nuclear critic, not unqualified, not as a matter of principle, just by looking at, as I see it, the picture, to that being called self-evidently irrational. I mean, it's, with football teams, how often do you, when you support one football team, are you called anti another? Of course you're not anti another. You just, on balance, think this is the one you want to support. So with energy technologies, it's really strange that when you are supporting another energy technology, you get called anti-nuclear. There's this weird sort of fixation, and far from others being irrational, that seems to be very irrational to approach these questions. How can we make this technology work? How can we get costs down? The rational thing is, what would be best for climate, for energy? And there, I mean, Fiona, you may want to come back on this, but it's not just in the UK that nuclear is outrageously uncompetitive. It's everywhere in the world. Lazard reviews do it. China, famously building lots of nuclear, but it's building even more solar and wind. It is all around the world unfeasibly expensive. It's just because it has this ability to develop infrastructures for nuclear military purposes that different countries around the world are varyingly willing to spend what it takes to do that. And that's the real rational reason. To deny it is also actually quite toxic to democracy. As I fear at the moment, it's not just climate and energy strategies being warped by this irrational fixation. It's perfectly legitimate to support nuclear because that's the way we have nuclear weapons in the world, and the world needs nuclear weapons. And the more we have, the better. You can take that position, but please do it openly. At the moment, our democracy is being subverted because essentially that position is not being stated when it's the real driver behind nuclear technology generally.
Can I just interject on this? Because I found this discussion extremely interesting, and I mean, I want to go back to one of the concepts, which was this idea of obsolescence and it's interesting to me because obviously as an historian of science, I look at exactly those processes. When is it that technologies emerge, develop, thrive, and then decline? And looking at the history of atomic energy is kind of funny because one of the items that seems to kind of carry through the whole history is not just the history of the technology per se, but the promises that it carries. And I mean, I'm sorry, but I mean, my students can tell you that the very same claims about miniaturizing atomic energy have been done since the 1950s. We have amazing illustrations, you can look at them at my course, of Soviet Union cars that were fueled to atomic energy, planes, and all sorts of other technologies that at the time already was kind of... My sense is that unfortunately that there's something about atomic energy which is striking, which is that promise that sometimes we hear about. I mean, I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to criticize any miniaturizing project here, but it has been a lot of times kind of not fulfilled. The history of atomic energy as a kind of means of energy production is a history that is constantly hampered, for instance, by accidents. Accidents have really historically hampered the development of atomic energy as a means globally of producing energy across the last 40 years. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, obviously, I don't know. I don't think that in this room I need to recall Chernobyl. But I mean, I'm thinking on the other side whether we can think of equivalents in other means of producing energy, renewables, for instance, that are comparable. I mean, did solar have the same kind of accidents? Did winds? Maybe hydro did. I mean, we need to be very clear about this. There have been hydropowered plant accidents in the past that, you know, have been quite staggeringly problematic on big structures. But I mean, atomic energy carries that kind of baggage that, in a sense, is kind of dragging the whole process of, I mean, let's not think about accidents, let's think about waste. I mean, it's something distinctively unique. I'm trying to figure out if there are other energy sectors that produce the same kind of waste that, in a sense, haunts us for the future in the same way. There isn't. I mean, you can think, for instance, that the products, the waste products from solar energy has been problematic. They contain toxic substances, they contain cadmium, they contain lead. They are poisonous, they're not nice, fair enough. But we know that over a certain period of time, we'll get rid of it. We are building a plant, a 66 billion pounds plant, under the sea, to carry in all the waste that has been produced in this country over the last 50 years. 750,000 cubic meter of waste. So is the history of the atomic energy that in a sense is still there, as a very tangible example of something that is haunting us. Again, I haven't got big answers on what we need to do next in terms of Cut Zero, but I see this as pretty much problematic issues that really hamper the development of atomic energy long term. But I mean, that's my view.
So if I can come back, I'll come back on two things if that's okay. I'll come back on waste, but I want to come back on economics first of all.
Yeah.
So a couple of things to say about economics. So I'll go back to the point I made around the cost of construction of a nuclear power plant. And if you actually look at the overall life cycle cost of a nuclear power plant, around 70 to 75% of these costs are around that capital infrastructure build up front. And so that's the bit that if you're focused on how you bring that cost down, that's the bit you focus on, because that's where the significant cost is. And the challenge with this for nuclear is that these nuclear plants operate for 60 or 80 years. That's a much longer time horizon in comparison to any renewable plant or a lot of gas plants or coal plants that you're ever going to see. So a lot of this is not a level playing field in terms of actually looking at that life cycle cost in terms of taking that forward. That's something else that's worthwhile considering. And if you're talking about a plant that you're actually operating for 80 years, but you still have to finance that up front, that's significant if you're trying to find 70 to 75% of that cost for that large infrastructure project. But that cost can come down, and the cost will come down, as I said, if you actually bring in a supply chain that understands what it's doing and it has that capability going forward. The other thing I would say about costs, when the war happened in Ukraine, the week of the war, the cheapest form of electricity in this country, and there is data to prove it, was nuclear. Because it was a time when the wind wasn't blowing, the sun didn't shine, and you actually look at where the cheapest form of electricity was coming from, it came from nuclear power. So there are times to show that nuclear can actually be the cheapest technology in a particular period in time. I'm sure you want to come back to that.
I do.
But I want to go to waste first of all, in terms of that too. Waste is absolutely an issue that we absolutely have to resolve. To take any nuclear technology forward, the waste issue continues to be something that we focus on, and we focus on a lot. A couple of things I would say though. The nuclear industry is the only industry that actually provides financial provision up front before it even operates its facility in terms of how you actually pay for that waste and how you deal with that waste in terms of how it's stored and then finally disposed of. The only industry that does that is the nuclear industry, and that happens throughout the world. Different mechanisms used for that, but
because the type of waste
but
is
it's
unique.
because of the type of waste is unique. If you then look at that type of waste, and there's various categories of waste, as we know, high level, intermediate level, low level, and very low level waste. The waste that's the really radioactive waste is 6% of the total inventory arisings that's actually being produced. So although it is waste that has to be dealt with, and has to be dealt with in a very particular and unique way, it is not the totality of the waste that's coming out of the nuclear power plant. It is 6% of that waste that basically has radiation, that is heat generating radiation, and it's stored safely in stores for a period of 50 years or more to enable that heat to decrease over time. And typically, if you actually store it for that 50-year period, you reduce about 99% of that radioactivity at that point. So there are a few points just to make around. I'm not saying we shouldn't look at it or anything like that, but I'm just trying to put it in a context.
Yeah. We have two interventions. Well, I'll start by Andy because he raised the hand first.
Thanks, yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's all right?
Yeah, no, you can.
I mean, you know, there's dangers of ding-dongs in this, but I'm trying to restrict myself just to really basic things. So 2 points of the many you made, Fiona. First of all, on the implication that renewables, wind and solar, when one takes account of the wind not blowing sometimes, which you're perfectly right, and the sun not shining, for instance, at night, are therefore then more expensive. We shouldn't be saying this kind of thing. The British government, who are extremely, on the world stage, highly favourable to nuclear, and you have to dig around to find the British government's own assessments, which I do, because I'm an enthusiast. And when you do that, you find enhanced levelised costs. They take account of the costs of storage, short, intermediate, long-term storage, and with the British government's own estimates of those costs, which people like me would contest, but let's not get into a ding-dong, it's still no contest. According to the British government's own data, if you include the cost of the different kinds of storage, wind and solar are still massively cheaper. On the point about the nuclear industry being the only industry, and my main work is about uncertainties, ambiguities, and you know, there's no such thing as evidence-based policy because uncertainties and values come into it. That's why I respect different views. But there are some things that we just shouldn't be saying. So nuclear technology is actually the only technology among energy technologies which has a dedicated international liability regime to protect it, to make sure that in the event that third-party losses are incurred beyond certain limits and across borders, it is not the industry that pays. The other technologies don't benefit. This is a dedicated regime run from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the Nuclear Energy Agency, limiting compensation. And with nuclear waste itself, we have yet to build. The Finns are making a serious stab at it. Things are happening. The UK is now getting more serious. But we have yet to build one of these facilities. And the history of nuclear infrastructure on all sides, we can concede, has not been pretty. The actual outturn costs have been massively larger, without exception, around the world, not just in the UK. Yeah. So when the nuclear industry says it has costed for these nuclear waste management facilities, that is only if we carry on purchasing nuclear electricity to fund across to them. The actual credibility with which the investments already laid down guarantee us to cover those costs is really also, I don't think it's credible at all. And history shows it to be even less so. So I'm sorry to refute you so starkly, Fiona, but I think this is the seriousness of the situation we're in the UK, that we discuss nuclear routinely in these really irrational terms.
Richard?
So I was just going to try and make one point that's a bit separate from these things. I think if the sort of population of Gen Zers and millennials who I referred to earlier sat in this room and watched us having this argument, they'd probably find it a bit disappointing. I mean, they'd start saying, you know, it's net zero we're worried about. Get your big boy pants on and stop arguing about waste and cost. I've been in nuclear a long time, and I could have sat in this room a long time and had discussions about waste and cost. And I've got no skin in this game. I'm not pro-nuclear, which is a phrase I've already banned, and there you go, I've just used it. I'm not, but it's, I think you said 70% or something is still far. You know, that's an enormous amount. And they're going to say, well, don't just argue about waste, just solve net zero. Work out whether nuclear can be part of that solution. Stop arguing about the cost. You know, look at this big existential threat over here and compare it to these smaller existential threats over here and get it together. So I think what we've got to do is disassociate all this thing about nuclear, stop arguing about waste and costs, and start looking at, because we'll do it forever. We will do it forever. We'll sit in this room and we'll do it forever. So we need to stop doing it.
That's a questionable point. Yeah.
But then it's a problem that obviously pits, in a sense, the renewable energy sector to an extent against the nuclear energy sector. And I'm not saying this in a kind of short-term way, but more in the long term in terms of prospects, in terms of possibilities to develop further. There is obviously a market to be won, right? So decisions will be made accordingly to where we want to go, whether we want to go renewable, whether we're going to go nuclear. And in that respect, I think, I mean, my own perspective, and here, I mean, again, I mean, I'm an historian, so I mean, I care not even that much about the kind of immediate decisions. I'm interested in processes, okay? When we look at processes, though, we start to see, you know, differences, unique aspects of atomic energy that, in a sense, I mean, really makes it more complicated at the moment to think. I mean, you know, I mean, why do we want to always stay in the UK? Can we go to Morocco, please? Okay, Morocco. Okay, Morocco, if you read the news yesterday or a few days ago, is about to invest with Rosatom on a massive nuclear energy project. On the other hand, Morocco is one of the largest investors in, for instance, in solar energy, right? With massive projects running at the moment around 2 megawatts, you know, under development. So how do we put these two projects together? I mean, for instance, as an historian, to me, it's very interesting because the Rosatom Moroccan project is actually something that one can trace it back to the 1970s, where Morocco started already, and here we go back to the issue of promise, thinking about atomic energy, started investing, wanted a research reactor, all sorts of problems, proliferation, non-proliferation, safety, essentially made that project unfeasible for about 20 years. 1979, they were still discussing whether to have the Trigger American reactor or not. 1980s, cancelled the project. They had this kind of machine hanging there somewhere. 1990s, they bought another reactor, Trigger 2 Mark II, okay? Where obviously they had to wait another 10 years before it actually went into operation. 2004 went into operation, 2007 went critical, okay? So these are the time scales of a nuclear project, for instance, for developing countries, because we can't think about energy just in terms of the UK. We need to think about developing countries too, right? So this is the kind of time span, 30 years. You know how long it took to the Moroccans to do the solar energy project? 5. 2013.
Do you know how long it took to build Calder Hall? 6 years.
But we know the consequences of that, right? We know the consequences of building Calder Hall in 5 years.
Andy,
Called Hall, that's the plutonium production reactor for the British military program.
Yeah, exactly.
It also put electricity on the grid, though, as well.
When the Queen pulled the lever, it looked like it was doing it, yeah. But let's not... the climate issue is so crucial. I just want to really address that up front, because you're right to raise it in the way you did, Richard. But I realise you made this argument in good faith. But this is another example. This idea that we have to do everything. Since when was it the case that an urgent problem means we do everything, including things that are really inefficient? That is not how you address an imperative problem. An imperative problem you address in the most effective ways. And if something is 3, 4, 5 times more expensive and causes a host of other problems as well, but let's not go to there, but if we're only concerned about climate, then you don't do that thing. You do the other things. You spend the available money on the other things as well, unless they're constrained, which we can come into. So again, it's a really irrational way. And when it's then spiced up with the sort of Gen Z, I don't know why Gen Z would be thought to be a generation who will somehow want to do everything. I started work, I'm not Gen Z, obviously, I'm an old geezer. That argument works well. Their PR companies are working very hard to how to contest arguments of old lag critics like myself, and to pick on the age. I started climate campaigning in the 1980s. So I've been working I'm 63 now, for more than 40 years on climate campaigning. I don't know who else has been doing that, internationally and nationally. And so there is absolutely no climate rationale for doing something that's manifestly less effective. And the fact that that argument is put by the government is a sign of this kind of irrationality I'm talking about. There are other reasons behind that. It's being cynically manipulated, that argument, in order to protect a technology that is actually ineffective at climate mitigation, but actually good for the thing that the government really wants, which is military. I'm sorry to put it so starkly, but that is the situation that we are in the UK at the moment. We are being systematically misled on the most important issue in the world. And I'm a kind of genial guy, but that makes me quite angry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. We have a few questions from the audience, so just to kind of change it on. Do you want to start, Reza?
Hi. Yeah, I have a quick question. So, if I go back to the actual original question, is nuclear the path towards net zero? Can I change it and say, is there a path towards net zero that doesn't involve nuclear? And how can you imagine that? What would that path look like, taking into account the supply chain of the different sources of energy? So if you're talking about solar, if you talk about wind, the supply chains for the materials needed for a lot of those reactors, they're not available in the UK. And if we go to the market, and if other countries go into the market, suddenly cost then becomes a major issue, because we're not in charge of the supply chain. We're having to buy abroad, and demand will change this stuff. So what can you see a path towards net zero when nuclear isn't a part of it, knowing as well that demand for nuclear, for electricity is going to skyrocket with the introduction of electric cars and more electric, carbon-free sources of things, switching to battery-powered technology a lot more. The demand's going to go up. Is there actually a path towards net zero that you can envision when nuclear isn't a part of it?
Mm-hmm.
And what would that look like?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's for you, Andy.
Yeah, I'm happy, but I'm sure other colleagues have got views on this. So yes, there is. I don't want to trivialise that. You're absolutely right to raise these issues. There are all kinds of problems with supply chains, international dependencies, especially in the world as it is now, rare materials. So you're right to raise the issue. It's non-trivial. It applies, of course, to nuclear as well. But nonetheless, renewables aren't a get-out-of-jail-free card. We do live in a world where, I emphasise my age, but we've seen these the resource limits arguments, whether it be for uranium. Uranium is not a serious limit for nuclear because of the way uranium stocks, like oil stocks and other stocks, there's an inflation, there's an inbuilt incentive to depreciate reserves to up the price. The same is true for some of the rare earths in the renewables. So there's a problem. It's not as big as we think. It applies across. But more often we hear arguments about the limited resource, that somehow renewables are limited. And in fact, again, just to illustrate the eccentricity of the British debates, a wonderful chap, David Mackay, a medical physicist, wrote a book, very enthusiastic about physics, wrote a book, many people may know it, Nuclear Energy Without Hot Air. It was fated. It's a very clearly written book. I enjoyed it for that reason. But I met him, I was on government committees at the time, met him quite often, because as soon as he'd written a book, funded by the chief funder of the Labour Party, Lord Sainsbury, for free, distributed for free all around the country, sustainable energy without hot air, what David Mackay said was that the physical limits, physics tells you, there is not enough renewable energy in the UK to do as you're saying. In fact, to even meet lesser demands than we're now talking about. David Mackay very sadly died prematurely. I asked him, I had the chance to ask him, but David, how can you be speaking of physical limits without any reference to price? That the more you pay, the more you get. His book didn't include that. It was, when he wrote that book, he completely flew in the face of decades of government assessment showing there was enough. He was insisting there wasn't with the authority of physics. Within 5 years of that book being published about the physical limits to UK renewables, the built renewables exceeded it. He was made chief scientist on the back of that book. What kind of country makes someone a chief scientist, not from the field, for refuting government evidence going back over decades, for saying something that's wrong within 5 years, and then we have no discussion about it, that we now have? So the point I'm making is, there is no serious basis for saying there are not enough renewables, wind, solar, others as well coming on stream, to provide for what are, you're right, a rapidly increasing electricity demand needs. It's not credible, and the history of these claims is not only incredible, it's actually quite alarming that a country like the UK would have a history that I've just summarised. So that would be my answer to you.
So let me have a go. So, I mean, with any of these things, the answer has to be, yes, there's a way of doing it without nuclear. So the question is, what would need to be true in order for that to happen? So people would need to be very prepared to have a significant amount of land mass used up in these isles for renewable space. Would need to be very comfortable with a lot of the waters around our country to be covered in windmills and other types of renewable resource, because they do take up quite a lot of land mass in terms of doing that. We would need to have got much further on in terms of the R&D that's currently required in terms of battery storage to deal with the issues when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine. Then in terms of decarbonising the rest of the energy mix, renewables could play a role in terms of hydrogen production, for example, and heat generation, but they are costly from that side of things. And so there would need to be a way of being able to bring down that price over time in terms of doing that. I think as well we would probably have to do more on carbon capture and storage in terms of them being able to further deep decarbonise the rest of the energy mix. And there's still a lot of research to be done in terms of how you deal with carbon capture and storage going forward. So you take all that into account and you probably could do it. I think where you would get to, and there's been quite a lot of economic models that have been done to actually look at this. You get to a situation where it's maybe possible, if you, as far as maybe getting to about 90% decarbonisation, but not full decarbonisation, and it's very costly. And so you then come back to a discussion around the role that nuclear can play, and where it should play, and how much of the energy mix it should play in terms of enabling that mix to be successful. My view is that nuclear does and should play a role and can play a role in decarbonising that future energy mix, but it's with renewables and it's with other technologies as well. And the way then do you then have a debate about how much nuclear do you have? You basically then have a discussion about, well, let's actually have a discussion about the economics, and then we make a decision at that point about how much nuclear we have at that stage.
Yeah. We have two more questions at the back, so Fran, if you can pass the microphone, please.
So just to go back to the kind of hazards of nuclear, it's been well documented that it has, out of all the means of generating energy, about 2 or 3 orders of magnitude less deaths per unit of energy generated than anything else, which basically is essentially zero carbon. There's no other pollution generated, even accounting for the obvious accidents we've had, 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, Chernobyl, etc. There's been so many less deaths per unit energy of nuclear that's been generated over the past 60, 70 years than anything else. Is that not an argument in itself to kind of expand the capacity? And I know you've said about it being used in concert with renewables and storage, baseload power essentially.
We have 3 answers for the questions.
Oh,
I'll start by Richard.
Oh, well, all I was going to say was I was making an argument earlier about we need to stop talking about hazards and risks and costs and stuff, and I would apply that in both directions. I would say that, you know, I'm tired of having this debate for all this time. I think we've got to step above it. You know, if we could get rid of nuclear, then yeah, fine, I'm up for that. Let's do that. If I believed there was an alternative which would be pursued and prosecuted in the pace in the world that we needed to do to meet this, you know, I'm all over it. Yeah, let's do that. Fine. But then we'll be talking about hazards, and we'll be having counter argument about hazards and costs and economies and multiples and all that business. About all these things, and I just believe we need to rise above that, because I've sat in a lot of these rooms over a lot of time, and I'd just like to move the debate somewhere else.
Can I just...
Sorry, but I'm just allowed Andy to if you...
Yeah, okay, I don't mind what you order. Yeah, I agree with that, Richard. Just very briefly on Fiona's last point about, because it's such an important point, about the cost of, to answer your questions, zero carbon futures. The Royal Society have a track record of being really quite strong proponents of nuclear power historically. Yeah. People like me complain regularly about that. But take a look at the Royal Society report of, what is it now, 3 months ago. which looked at, after an exhaustively long process, looked at exactly this question of what proportion of nuclear might be optimal, just as Fiona said. Nothing. There is no scenario that the Royal Society explored for a contribution by nuclear which would do anything other than, under their assumptions, which people like me would criticise for being too favourable to nuclear, but nonetheless they found there is no contribution to the future UK electricity supply mix where nuclear would not raise the cost for the consumer. So that's not me, that's the Royal Society. On this point about risk, I agree with you that we all get tired of being in these rooms banging on about figures this way. I actually did my PhD back in the early 90s on exactly this question of comparative risk assessment, extended external cost analysis, life cycle analysis, input-output analysis of nuclear versus other energy technologies. And yes, you can find studies that show, as you say, that nuclear is favourable. You can also find studies that show the other way. These studies are utterly driven by their assumptions. And you pick your assumptions, you get your answer, basically. And all sides misuse that. The short answer is you cannot decisively argue for any of these technologies on the basis of comparative risk unless you're willing to be really partisan and insert assumptions in advance that favour your kind of answer. And that's true on all sides. All sides play games with this, which is why I agree with you, Richard.
Can I just add something quickly? And I'm sorry, I mean, again, to stress again, I'm an historian. Maybe I said it before. But this is exactly where I think that there's something important that perhaps, and is to start doubting seriously about any data that is out there about the real risk of nuclear energy, partly because of what Andy was saying earlier, about the importance that this kind of technology has been playing also in state affairs, which has put it in a very specific regime of disclosure of information since the very beginning and up to now, whereby a lot of circumstances where effectively there has been serious issues, accidents, problems, effects on humans, on health, have been pretty much buried. And we are still, I mean, I'm talking here not just as an historian, but sometimes as a very angry historian, right? Because I'm frustrated that I can't actually know more about this. The Chernobyl accident is something that for many years, partly because of the Soviet regime and the Soviet administration of information, has been pretty much not leading into a serious disclosure of what were the victims of that specific case. And interestingly enough, I mean, and this is where, I mean, my unit is so great, because students actually research stuff that I never thought about. I thought that Chernobyl was Chernobyl because essentially of the Soviet way of dealing with information and burying it. I mean, I recently got a little bit of a research done by a student looking at the 3 Mile Island accident and discovering that actually the Americans were doing exactly the same, covering up any information about the health effects of the 3 Mile Island accident. So what we know right now, unfortunately, I'm afraid, guys, but it's a little bit, you know, tentative, uncertain, and I don't want to talk about hazard either, but I mean, the level of knowledge we have about the health impacts of some of these accidents and problems, it's very partial.
So all I was going to say was, if you want to look at data, the data's out there. The data's out there in terms of, you know, the information out there, as has been highlighted, around the fact that nuclear is a technology, is a sector that has much less deaths in comparison to any other sector that's producing energy. So if you want to look at data, the data's out there, pros and cons. I'm with Richard. Let's actually have a debate about how we enable net zero. And actually let's have a debate about how you actually you take that forward through whatever technologies that there are available today to make it happen.
Richard?
Yeah, all I was going to say about that is I think it's much more healthy to talk about things we don't know than things we do. I was talking about doing this debate with my kids, they're in their 30s. But, and I explained the argument about nuclear, and they just said to me, that's gaslighting. And also, if you think you're going to save the planet, you're also virtue signalling. So
you can't win, can you?
Yeah, you cannot win. I think we need to bear that in mind. I think it's much more, it brings us much more together cohesively if we talk about what we don't know and what we don't understand and have some humility in the debate than argue the toss about the things we think we do.
Yeah, just a quick one.
Very quick, yeah, just on that point about humility and the point about data. Whatever side you're on, whatever your dispositions are, whatever you're looking to inform yourself about, don't just take data at face value. The tendency to speak of the data is out there. It's not out. It's out there in multifarious forms. If you're interested in data, ask about sensitivities. Only trust sources that tell you their uncertainty ranges. Only trust sources that tell you when you tweak their model how they get different answers. If the source from whatever side it's on doesn't do that and it just presents itself as the data, don't trust it.
Yeah, facts.
Because there's such a history of misuse. Going back to times when Chernobyl-style accidents, Fukushima accidents were impossible or of negligible risk. We have a history here of the way this stuff gets used, and I'm really quite amazed again that we're still talking about data and risk assessment in those definitive terms when it's manifestly shown itself not to be.
Yeah. Anika, do you want to ask?
Thank you all for your really interesting discussion so far. Following on from what Richard said about just kind of having to be a bit humble and do what we need to do to sort out climate change, and Simone's comments about that we can't just talk about the UK, especially when we're talking about net zero, because that's a global challenge. And obviously we've talked about like renewables and how they're important, and I think it is clear we need a diverse range of approaches. But specifically for nuclear, it's often only been kind of limited to certain countries who are able to use it. Do you think there is a way that it can be expanded across a wider range of countries, and what needs to be done for that to happen?
Do you want to talk?
Maybe if I start. So there's quite a lot happening in this space at the moment, especially through some of the multilateral organisations. So the IAEA and the OECD Nuclear Energy Agency is doing quite a lot with various countries at the moment, emerging nations, in terms of the role that nuclear energy could play. So, for example, there's a lot happening in the Africa continent at the moment. A number of the African countries are interested in the role that nuclear could play, and so as a result of that, there are countries like the United States and others who are working with the IAEA and the NEA to see if there is opportunity in terms of taking that forward. And I think that there is a role for these organisations, the IAEA and the NEA, to continue to help with emerging nations and help them come to a conclusion in terms of if they were to have nuclear technology in their country, what do they have to have in place in order for that to happen? From a regulatory regime, as a starting point, all the way through to how you actually build that infrastructure, how you then train people, how you enable them to be able to operate these plants going forward, and basically whether that is the sort of technology that you actually need for what your requirements are. The African nations, as an example, are very interested in this, not just for energy, they're also very interested in it in terms of being able to have clean water. So, that's another, good example of that in terms of being able to take that forward. So I would say, yes, it's happening, and we probably need to do more.
Taking though an holistic perspective, there's a couple of things to consider. The first is obviously that the problem of net zero is ultimately a problem of countries that at the moment are producing an overwhelming amount of carbon emissions. There's 5 countries in the world producing around 60, I think, % of the overall carbon emissions, 20 in total producing 76%. So it's really a problem of developed countries rather than developing countries. Clearly, developing countries come into the picture in terms of making decisions about the future energy mixes and how they will combine various sorts of... Now, I made an example earlier, jokingly perhaps, about Morocco. It's a generalized problem, as in obviously atomic energy carries with it, nuclear energy carries with it the problem of the military uses, which becomes a serious hindrance to actually exporting those kind of technologies safely. And that is the reason why a lot of projects get delayed for quite some time, exactly because then there's a lot of checks, there's a lot of expert control, there's a lot of expert technologies that needs to be taken into account. Even before we do that, Africa has 6 reactors. Africa, a continent, has 6 reactors in total, and most of them are research reactors.
Yep.
So it's not been easy at all to develop atomic energy as something that could be sold to Africa, exactly for that reason, because obviously whoever sells them, those type of technologies, are worried about the military consequences. Renewable energy sources don't make those kind of problems. I mean, I've been trying to look at how we can use militarily renewable energy technologies. I didn't find much, I must say. I wanted to be as imaginative as possible and think, can, for instance, wind blades be used militarily? I couldn't find any answer, I'm afraid. So there's a big discrimination point that I think needs to be taken into account.
Do you want?
Yeah.
Do you want to go or shall I?
No, you go.
So I think it's a great question, and it's interesting. I guess we are in Manchester as a Dalton Institute, so questions about how can we get nuclear expanded around the world, as if it were an end in itself, should be expected. But just because I think maybe the motivation for this is climate, that climate really matters, we've got to take it seriously. So here's because I care so much about that as well, you don't look at it first, you don't ask questions like that. How can we make nuclear? You say, how can we make our actions and our money spending as effective as possible? And it's really interesting. Some colleagues and I did a study now 3 years ago, which I was amazed to find had never been done before. And it was a very simple study. It was actually quite complicated to implement statistically, but fortunately it wasn't me doing that, it was colleagues. The study was this: what can we say with all the uncertainties about the empirical record? There's lots of models which you talked about. The empirical record of national climate emissions abatement and its association, because this is not causal, it's association with nuclear uptake. We can say something if we look empirically at it. We publish it in Nature Energy, and what you can say is that nuclear has a contrary relationship to efficacy in reducing carbon emissions. It's not causal, there's all sorts of factors go in, but you can say also that nuclear and renewables don't fit well. Renewables are cheaper, the empirical evidence shows them to be better, a stronger association with carbon emissions reductions. For whatever reason, it may just be an association, but because they're better, and it also shows they don't coexist with nuclear healthily. There's all sorts of technical reasons for that, to do with the kind of grid and institutions. So if we actually, rather than seeing nuclear as an end in itself, ask about the real end, which is climate, the empirical evidence is really striking. It's amazing that 30 years of the IPCC modelling, no one did an empirical test. And when we did it, we had 6 major studies launched against us, demanding that Nature Energy withdraw our paper on principle because of its findings. Nature spent 1.5 years going through. We had to respond to all those 6, all from nuclear institutes around the world. All 6 were rejected. But they weren't just saying we disagree with this study, they're saying you should withdraw that paper. The paper is not withdrawn, it's still there, 6 attempts to withdraw it. So we have to ask ourselves, why do you get this backlash when you do a very simple study for the first time in 30 years, which is an answer to your serious question? How to achieve it? Nuclear, though, if you take your question seriously there, if you want nuclear as an end in itself, militarize the world. Make people feel insecure. Have a world, oh dear, this is a bit familiar, which is polarized, and then people feel fearful, pick up Richard's point. They want nuclear, the option of nuclear weapons, they want to be able to develop, like Japan, in 6 months, then they need nuclear. If you want a world where everyone is pursuing military nuclear technologies, that is the world in which civil nuclear will thrive. So if it's an end in itself, then go for an unsafe world where everyone's terrified and wants to terrify other people even more with threats of nuclear weapons.
Do you have more questions from the audience? Okay. I have a question about if we assume that nuclear can or should play a role, at least at the moment, how do you see that we can solve problems that we had in the past? So, the last time the UK had a large nuclear program, in the 80s or 70s, there was a lot of criticisms on the design choice, the economic questions. How can we avoid that? We mentioned SMRs and microreactors, but those as I understand at least, the cost of those small reactors is larger than big power plants. So how do you see that there a way to kind of build nuclear to be efficient and avoid like the mistakes that we had in the past.
Do you wanna
Yeah,
go?
I'll have first go. I don't think we can, is my answer. I think if nuclear is approached as it is now, large reactors will always be built that way, and those problems will always occur. So I don't think that is a solvable problem, which is, at the risk of sounding like a stuck record, which is why I'm so sort of interested, without any particular pro or anti-nuclear. I've done it again. I've used pro-nuclear again. I'm sort of
You're the only one
interested
who's-
in microreactors because they introduce the possibility of really changing the debate in some sort of way, which I think has value in itself. And I'm also too old to think about evolutionary things. I'm more interested in revolutionary and disruptive things that might change the debate. But in answer to your specific, my experience tells me we won't, and we'll just keep going around that loop.
I'll say two things if I can.
Yeah.
First thing is finish your design before you pour the concrete. That would be a good start. That's been a problem in the past. And you know that if you actually start building something before you have a finished design, it's probably going to cost more. So I'd definitely finish the design before you pour the concrete. And then the second thing, I go back to supply chains. Don't build up a supply chain and then let it go again. Build it and use it.
Joan, you had a question?
Well, I'd like to say some things which will quite surprise Andy, actually. And it's also raising the spectre of unabated natural gas power. I don't know whether you noticed in January, our beloved Prime Minister and the Secretary of State for Energy Security made a statement that we needed to have a new construction plan of building a whole new generation of unabated gas plants which would prevent power cuts as we approached net zero, and we needed to fill in the gaps that solar and wind, which are the cheapest forms of generating electricity, but they're variable and unpredictable. The sun tends to shine in the summer when it's when the energy is not quite needed so much, and the wind blows when it wants to, and there are periods when there's no energy, and that has to be filled in. And the government, if you look in the high electricity scenario, which is presented by DESNES, the main way of filling in the gaps, two ways. One is 24 gigawatts of baseload nuclear and 60 gigawatts of new, because the plants are being phased out at the moment, so a whole new generation of unabated natural gas plants. And that's the government's policy. Now, I've got a solution. We did some calculations, and we looked at what the effect of putting in 24 gigawatts of baseload nuclear makes the situation worse. You get more, particularly for solar, you will get curtailment of solar, and it just raises the platform and pushes some of the wind and solar above the demand limits. So we would then have to have expensive programs of storage and things like that. Putting in these natural gas plants is extremely expensive. They're operated at extremely low capacity factors, so that recovering the investment is very difficult. And not only that, we built all of these plants with all of the emissions associated with the construction of these plants. And they're only going to contribute to a very tiny fraction of our energy requirements. The solution is to look at nuclear for production of hydrogen and all the other applications that we can use nuclear for in what's called in the trade cogeneration, and then just steal a little bit of that power and shove it on the grid when it's needed. Solution is found, and it also finds a solution to your problem, Andy, because it's the cheapest way of doing it. And we're shortly going to be publishing a paper on that. Thank you.
That's great, thank you.
That was also a Royal Society paper as well on cogeneration.
Yes.
Did you have some?
I just, I mean, again, always doubt about this kind of ideas about structural limit as set once and for all, and then, we need to find that amount of energy because that's the only. I mean, this government has taken critical decisions that have completely shifted the table of the discussion around electricity production. One, with the Cameron government deciding about the fact that any project of wind panels had to be taken with the approval of local communities, which has crippled the economy and essentially not make it possible to continue those kind of projects for several years. Other decisions taken in developed countries, in Italy, for instance, or in the UK, about the building of housing, the housing projects and the building of houses. There's a clear indication from climate change panel regulations that the most effective measure at the moment is not about energy production, it's about how we source our energy in this kind of housing situations, how we, for instance, make housing more effective from the point of view of internal thermal energy conservation, how we produce it so as to have autonomous means of producing energy, solar panels, and so on. So this kind of discussions about structural limits that sometimes, and it's not a criticism towards, I actually like the idea of the kind of, little kind of nuclear generator for the rest of the grid. But what I'm saying is there's an underlying issue, which is sometimes we think of structural issues for things that have been decided politically at a certain point and then creates the kind of structural limits that we see out there. But these are political decisions, they are not structural limits.
Do you have more points? Yeah.
Yeah, just on this point, Joanne, thanks for, my short answer would be good luck with that, that nuclear is the cheapest. It remains to be seen, it would be interesting when your study is published. But I'd say at the early part of what you said, Joanne, that renewables are cheaper, but they are intermittent, variable. We shouldn't really be saying that anymore, because it's really beyond contest now. I've mentioned the sources through the course of this discussion. They haven't been contested. Renewables are cheaper with that, and it includes long-term storage. It includes hydrogen. The Royal Society report within great detail looked at long-run, multi-year hydrogen storage in salt caverns that already exist. So I'm not saying, you use the language of solutions, Joanne, in favour of nuclear. I wouldn't use that language because it is open. There's all kinds of different views to be taken into account. We shouldn't be claiming the solution. But the idea that renewables are cheap except, oh dear, they're variable, that's just not legitimate anymore, because they are cheap even when that's dealt with. And on the hard to abate, deep decarbonisation, steel, concrete, chemicals, these are genuine problems again. You're right, Fiona, to highlight that. But which country can we think of in Europe which is the leader in those areas, heavy industry? Which country can we think of that has a history of making early environmental decisions and then making money on the fast move towards the cheaper alternatives? It's Germany. Germany is not having a serious debate about deep decarbonisation needing nuclear. It's rightly or wrongly, they could be wrong, but they're envisaging a completely different strategy. So there's a lot to be argued about still, a lot of devil in the detail. But I just wanted to sort of, the nuclear solutionism is in danger of leading us astray in this new area of deep decarbonisation.
Well, I would just point out that Germany is, you know that they're paying Denmark at the moment to curtail their solar and wind power because it's affecting the price of electricity in Germany. So Germany is not a good example here. And on hydrogen, yes, you've got to be able to produce the hydrogen cheaply. Now, as you rightly know, solar is only available 11% of the time in the UK, in our northern climates. Solar electricity producing hydrogen by electrolysis is expensive because of that. because the capacity factor affects the cost. Wind is better, but it's still too expensive. Solar, wind and nuclear together can actually make the cheapest hydrogen.
Thank you, Joe. I'm conscious of time, so we're running out of time. But does anyone have any kind of concluding points? If not, then thank you everyone for attending. It's been a great event. I hope you enjoyed it. And yeah, hope you took some idea back home. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks for the invitation.